we are attracted to these qualities of life in excess, right? And again, that's what the gods represent and so on. And I think therein lies a morality, right? The attraction to the qualities of life in excess, but also the drive to try to create the qualities of life in excess, right? The drive towards them, the drive towards heroism, towards beauty, towards kind of improving man each generation, striving for things like the Übermensch, striving to build the most beautiful buildings, the tallest buildings, and so on.
Salvete legionaries across the globe, and not just this globe, but every globe, in every stratosphere, in every universe, to every legionary, whether human or beyond human, beyond man. Perhaps there is an Übermenschen race of aliens far beyond even Mars, far beyond the Milky Way. But today we have just one of those individuals coming from a faraway planet that some of you may have heard of. Previously, he said Mars, but upon closer examination, what he considers Mars is not what we perceive Mars through our human understanding of things. This is a whole new planet. And of course, the Ark, one such being I mentioned earlier, has joined us today from his faraway land. Welcome, Imperator.
Yes, hello. How are you doing today on planet Earth?
It's going all right. We miss you over here. It's a shame that we have to communicate via telecommunications and cybernet instead of in person like last time, triple vax and triple mast. But we'll just have to do with what we have.
Yeah, we'll just have to cope somehow.
Exactly. Well, the topic of conversation that I wanted to talk about for the legionaries today was aesthetic morality. I think that's something that both of us, especially you recently, with your videos on liberalism and the sort of meta behind liberalism, there is this sense of morality that has subverted the true force, the true life force of, I think, the virile man in modernity. And whether you call that Christianity or whether you call that liberalism, whether you call that Marxism, it is clear that this morality, quotation marks, which sort of benefits the weaker man, which benefits the man who cannot attain, so he must bring everyone down to his level. This has become the objective morality of the 21st century and even the 20th century. And today we want to talk about a more vitalist morality, which is aesthetic morality, which is Mike Mentzer, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sun and Steel, Yukio Mishima maxing. You get what I'm saying, Ark?
Absolutely.
So I guess because this is something you've been doing a lot of videos on recently, why don't you just briefly describe the sort of phenomena of modern morality as we know it today?
Definitely. Well, I guess to start, I would say the easiest way to approach this subject, the most digestible way for anyone really who's not a Nietzsche nerd or reading Homer line by line to dissect hidden meaning in the words, is to look at how morality can get in the way of life. And so, for example, someone might become celibate for moral reasons, and then they, of course, don't reproduce, which is getting in the way of life. Or someone might become a vegan for moral reasons, which is likely to dampen their vitality, right? Their virility, their energy, and so on, because they're probably not getting the right nutrients, even if they supplement. And so these are concrete ways where you can see that morality can get in the way of life. There could be, many other ways, and there can clearly be ways in which this could occur on a civilizational level, right? People or civilization can start doing what is actually worse for it and hastens its destruction for moral reasons. Many policies in the West today, like mass migration, for example. But then we'd have to ask, well, what is life, right? When you're saying something's getting in the way of life. And that's obviously a hard question to answer, and I've made lots of videos trying to get at it. Nietzsche would say the will to power. But I think the essential thing to understand is that life is active, it's not passive, right? We have instincts, for example, driving us to do things. We have instincts driving us when we see a beautiful woman, driving us to go reproduce, instincts driving us to engage with the world. So life is an active force, and essential to this active force is a sort of will or drive towards expansion, towards growth, and all these sorts of things. And towards just general thriving, towards vitality, right? And that's a good enough definition, I think, when you're coming at this question and looking at how morality could get in the way of life thriving and so on.
I think it's interesting because from the perspective of Nietzsche, we get a lot of a moral skepticism, a critique of morality, but not really a solution. A lot of people will say, well, Nietzsche critiques morality and critiques all these slave moralities, but what does he give us as a solution? What does he tell us as a solution? And I think what's sad, right, is that Nietzsche was trying to create a sort of new morality, a transvaluation of all values. And this was what will to power was supposed to be. And of course, the deterioration of his health stopped him from doing this. But I think as a student of Nietzsche, and right, what is that quote from Nietzsche? It's something along the lines of the uh, the disciple who doesn't contribute to the teachings of his master doesn't do him justice, something like that. That's not the exact quote, obviously, but essentially what Nietzsche is saying is, well, you have to add to what I'm teaching you. You can't just memorize every line of Nietzsche and consider yourself a Nietzschean. You have to create new philosophy. And I think that the mission for students of Nietzsche becomes completing the mission that he could not complete on this earth, which is a transvaluation of all values, which is redefining morality, not just breaking down morality, but providing a new morality. You see guys like Jonathan Bowden attempt to do this, where he talks about, well, our kindness essentially is not being kind in the, let's say, Christian sense. Our kindness is not, we're going to take care of all these poor and sick. It's, well, we're going to lead the poor and sick to be strong, because that's virtue ultimately in the world, is strength. And kindness is uplifting people to be strong. It's not in helping the weak by charity. It's by, well, we're going to prepare you for the world. And I think that our mission becomes delving down to the actual roots of what life is. Kind of what you say, well, what is life, right? And once you define what life is and you understand the processes of life, from there you can start to create an actual morality, a morality that, if you follow it, will lead to vitality, will lead to strength, and will lead to power. And I want to take this back to a very material explanation for life. And, obviously, we have a wide array of viewers on both of our channels, going all the way from Christians to atheists, from neo-pagans to futurists, whatever. So there may be disagreement on my scientific definitions for the material causes of life. But if we take science at face value and we accept the premises, then life begins with energy. Energy is the first form of anything that eventually leads to life. Energy becomes what creates liquid, which creates gas, what creates mass. Everything comes from energy. And of course, the idea of the Big Bang is you have this very small piece, not piece of energy, but this very small condensement of energy. All the energy you have at the beginning of the Big Bang is the same amount of energy we have now. The only difference is energy expanded. And from the expansion of energy, you have the expansion of space. And I think you can kind of use this material explanation to describe Nietzsche's will. The will of energy is entropy. It's to expand until every, atomic level of energy is equally spread out. The way I describe quantum physics is, the goal is you have this ball of Play-Doh, and essentially what entropy is spreading that Play-Doh across a table until it's too thin to spread anymore. So the will, entropy, is to expand, it is to go outwards. And of course, from this, you have a lot of random functions like two pieces of energy coming together and forming mass. And from there, over, millions, billions of years, whatever, eventually you have the first life. So then we say, well, what is life? Life is movement. Life is kinetic motion. Life is a striving to expand, to move, to almost to occupy, right? And I think when we look at Nietzsche's will, what is the will? The will is something not metaphysical in the religious sense, but it almost has a sort of metaphysical replacement of what you must do in life. And what you must do is you must occupy, you must expand, you must conquer. So, of course, our very base function is reproduction. And I think when you look at life as it is, you look at life as something that is not guaranteed. You look at life as something where, well, to live, I must survive. And to survive, I must be powerful. I must be strong enough to ensure my survival. You start to arrive at certain objective principles which differ from classic Christian or Abrahamic morality, for instance. And I think once you understand life as struggle and you understand life as competition, as an arena of the gonal principle, you can start to actually figure out these certain forms which grant you more life. You figure out these forms, these ways of life, how to live, and you realize, well, if I follow these principles, like strength, for example, if I work out or if I am physically fit, this will lead to an increase of survival. That is an objective morality in a sense. So when we say aesthetic morality, it's looking at life as a struggle for power. And if life is a struggle for power, well, which things increase my power? Like Nietzsche says, what is good is what increases my power. What is bad is what decreases my power. And I'll get into some examples of what I believe are true objective principles of morality, but I just want to get your thoughts real quick, Ark, on what I just said.
Yeah, I think we could take it even a level deeper too, because something that's always interesting about Nietzsche is trying to figure out what is descriptive versus prescriptive in his writing. So on the one hand, he identifies that nature is amoral and by any moral standards, immoral, right? Life is the will to power, and this thing, biological life, will do all sorts of horrific stuff just for the sake of power. I mean, you could look at parasites in nature burrowing into their host and taking it over, or you could just look at lions ripping apart a young gazelle while it's still alive, or you could just look at human civilization and all the atrocities we commit. And you could even just look at the basic structures of life on the level of the cell, how everything is about consumption and structure and hierarchy and so on. But at the same time, Nietzsche does seem to buy into a value system, right? Because he talks about master morality and slave morality, and he obviously favors master morality. But more generally, he believes that life is good and should be encouraged. The flourishing of life should be encouraged, and that this impulse or will within life should be aided. And he says that history tends towards the smaller, towards the weaker, right? That great beings do not exist for long. They're kind of resisting entropy, right? So this is with great men or with great species. If you look at the history of life, even, you'll see that magnificent beasts like dinosaurs went extinct, while rodents and birds and things usually manage to survive, or often manage to survive mass extinctions. And it's the same with human history. Great cultures usually don't last that long. You have a renaissance, and then everything is pulled down back to the norm, back to the default. And life itself is something like this, right? Life is a striving away from the default state of matter, right? And life eventually, all living beings, of course, eventually die. They're eventually pulled back into the earth. They become dead matter again. So Nietzsche believes that we should actually, in some ways, be resisting the natural order. He's not just saying just engage in kind of might makes right and so on. He's saying that we should strive for the preservation of life and of the greatest types of life, the greatest civilizations, the greatest individuals, and so on. And from there, I think you can begin to develop a value system, right? Whether that's just classical pagan master morality, or you're creating a whole new value system, but you have a moral premise within the view that nature is brutal. And I think one other interesting thing also is to think about the premise which this worldview rests upon, which I was thinking about recently. And you could do this with every worldview. With Christianity, it really rests on belief in another world, belief in the soul. Of course, you can have secularized Christianity like Jordan Peterson style, but it really doesn't make sense when it comes down to it at the end of the day. And people are always asking Jordan, well, do you really believe in the resurrection? And do you believe in the soul? And so on. And for, I think, Nietzsche's worldview and the European pagan worldview in general, it all rests upon the idea that life is something that's intergenerational, an intergenerational process, hence the worship of the ancestors, hence the idea of the Übermensch, right? It all rests on that idea that life is a chain and that you can actually affect life, right? You can create a subsequent generation which is more powerful, more thriving, or one which is less so, which of course is kind of impossible within Christianity, because all that matters is the salvation of the soul, and the arc of history is controlled by God, and so on. So this, Nietzsche's whole morality and everything only really makes sense within a kind of pagan worldview.
It's interesting that you mention where Nietzsche almost strays from nature, not necessarily straying from acknowledging nature, but straying from just accepting what nature leads to. Because I think the reason why it is will to power, it's not will to life necessarily. Obviously, that's an aspect of it, but it is power, not life. Because it's like you say, the dinosaurs went extinct while the cockroaches survive. If everything was just about life, then there would be no reason not to be the cockroach. Why evolve at all? But I think evolution posits that power is, whether it is something inherent or it is an emergent property of life, it is something that burns brighter and that almost begins to take on a meta of its own. And what I mean by that is, well, let's look at entropy, for example, resisting entropy. Because if we just allowed entropy to take its course, well, one scientific theory is the Plato theory. Plato, not Plato, right? Like the ball of Plato spread out thinly enough, and once you spread out that Plato too thin, then that's essentially heat death. These molecules of energy, entropy leads them to expand to a point where there's essentially a balance, right? It's like a thermodynamic equilibrium, I think it's called, where all these energy particles are equally distant away from each other. Once that point comes, then all the processes of life stop. Time stops. Time is not a separate entity from energy. Everything is related to energy, time and space. None of that exists without the movement of energy. And of course, if energy is no longer moving, then time no longer moves and space no longer expands. At least this is, one of the theories of heat death. And what this means is life would cease to exist. So if we just let nature take its course, you would be denying life in a sense, because you would be allowing essentially the end of life. So there is this meta of will to power, which is resisting nature in a sense, which is resisting entropy. You're not just a stoic who lets everything happen and says, oh, it's okay. I'll just sit by and enjoy the sunset as the world burns. No, the Nietzschean philosophy is an active resistance and an active overcoming and an active role where you almost are trying to create that thing, that greater thing, which we generally describe as metaphysical. But of course, Nietzsche, in a lot of ways, will look at the material causes for these things. But just talking about metaphysics, and you mentioned the pagan worldview and why the pagan worldview is so valuable. I think from a materialist perspective, one can look at the gods as forms. Of course, you have Spinozan pantheism, for example, where you go back and you look at the gods, right? The pantheon of gods. Well, you have a god of thunder, for example, or you have a god of the sea. You have a god of the underworld. These things that represent physical forces in our life. And I think where the pagan worldview is so uh, valuable is that essentially what the gods are their forms to obtain power. They are forms of will to power. If you live in accordance with the gods, if you live to aspire to be like Hercules, for example, uh, then you live in such a way that's going to increase your power. This is almost an objective morality. If you say, well, if I'm going to live like Hercules, that means I'm going to be physically fit. I'm going to be courageous. I'm going to be heroic. I'm going to conquer. Then that is going to increase your power in a material sense, right? So that's almost an objective morality. It's a form that is almost objectively true because, well, if I do things that will make me stronger, I will be stronger. I will be more powerful, right? So then the gods, because Hercules becomes a god, he is, in fact, a quite powerful god in Greek mythology. But even the original Olympian gods like Zeus, if you give offerings to Zeus, you are living in such a way that, well, if I take the Olympian principles of Zeus or of Ares, I'm going to live in such a way that is going to make me more successful in life. That is going to increase my power. So in the pagan worldview, these gods are almost real in the sense that the forms of these gods, the characteristics of these gods, following these characteristics, worshiping these characteristics, engaging in principles will make you more powerful in actual life. So when we talk about aesthetic morality, I think this is a perfect description of that. It is, the meta, the really valuable meta is the meta which makes you stronger in actual life, which I think is very interesting. And even in Nietzschean philosophy, I think it's in Twilight of the Idols, he says, well, the most valuable, the greatest, the deepest philosophy is in your own body, right? Because ultimately that's what philosophy should be. It should be something that if you live by these philosophical principles, it increases your power, increases your ability to live an aesthetic life, to live a life where you have strength, vitality, where you can reproduce with your pick of the litter, this great goth girl harem that the Ark actually has, believe it or not. I've seen it myself. It's true. The Ark has 100 goth girls back in his planet, and 1,000 more will be coming as he increases in power. But before I pass it on to the Ark, there's a really interesting book I've been reading, which is called Prometheism, and it's by Jason Reza Giorgiani, who a lot of people think has really wild ideas, and no doubt, if you read what he has to say about time travel and aliens, it's pretty wild. But there's actually a lot of valuable stuff when he talks about the form of Prometheus. And what Prometheus represents for humanity is it represents the mortal trying to transcend to the divine. It's almost like overcoming nature. It's almost like defeating nature and man striving to be above nature. And I think this is exactly what we see when we talk about resisting entropy. Resisting entropy is literally trying to stop the inevitable heat death. What is more metaphysical than that? That is the truly Promethean struggle, is to essentially go from mortal to divine. And this is another form where it's like, well, if I live by this form objectively, if that increases my power, if living by the Promethean archetype and resisting entropy and resisting nature and even overcoming it, if that makes me essentially a god afterwards, then there's almost this objective principle and objective quality to living in such a way. And that almost makes it metaphysical, even if it's not metaphysical in the sense of something inherently spiritual. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. And let me go back to what we were talking about earlier too, and tie this in with Nietzsche and whether he's resisting nature or what's going on there. I think there's always confusion with the word nature because we use it in so many ways. We use it to denote just the material world. We use it to denote the biological world as differentiated from the material world, and then also human nature. And I, of course, prefer the use of nature, referring to biological life. But that's sort of irrelevant if we look at life and we can say life, biological life, this thing which is in plants and also in people is different from just pure matter like rocks and so on, then we could say Nietzsche is affirming life, right? That's what he's affirming. And he's affirming the nature of life. That's what his morality is about. So while in the arc of history and over the course of an organism's life, entropy wins out, right? We could say that's the nature of reality, is things breaking apart. And, over time, Nietzsche is affirming the nature of life, which is actually to resist this entropic force. That is the nature of life. It is a, anti-entropic force. And we can tie this to morality using the idea of the higher and the lower, which is integral to, ancient European pagan kind of ethics, and to what Nietzsche identifies as master morality, and also it's integral to Nietzsche's philosophy. So if we say that life has certain qualities inherently, then you could have more or less of these qualities, right? So, for example, if inherent to life is the drive to expand and to master your environment, let's say, we could see an organism that's very lethargic, that's just maybe laying around. We could look at it and probably identify that this organism is sickly. And because we can see it, it's behaving in a way which is not usual for life. We can also look at things like trees and compare them to animals and people. And we implicitly think that, animals and people are more alive than trees. And this might seem illogical. I mean, they're both alive, right? But if you stop thinking of life as an on-off switch, and again, start thinking of it as an energy, as, certain qualities, then it makes perfect sense, right? That a tree is alive, but it kind of has less life in it, has less of these qualities than, animals. And then even certain animals we might think are kind of more alive. They have more substance. They have more of this vital essence than other ones. Like, we implicitly value lions more than fleas, and so on. But the point is that if we can identify that life has certain qualities and these qualities can exist in differing degrees of intensity, then we can also posit higher forms of life. And that is kind of what the gods represent, right? So they represent all the qualities of life, the virtues of life, beauty, vitality, eternal youth, power, and so on, but, maxed out, right, to the highest degree. And a hero, who is usually a demigod, right, is then closer to the gods, but he is still mortal. And so you have this kind of hierarchy, and that's what Nietzsche also identifies in his idea of master morality, that morality, he says, originally was based off of the aristocratic caste affirming themselves, affirming their qualities, beauty, power, nobility, truth, elegance, and so on, as good. And then that means the bad is a kind of lack of these qualities, right? The base, the poor, the ugly, and, the unrefined, and so on. So you have then this kind of hierarchy where these virtues of life or qualities of life are most intense at the top, with the gods who are literally immortal, right? They represent undying life. And then as you go down the hierarchy, you have less and less of these qualities. And that's the basis for the idea of the Übermensch, right? Where you have, the last man who is kind of descending this hierarchy of life, and the Übermensch who is ascending it. The last man, in a certain sense, is becoming less alive. He's becoming, something like almost like a plant, right? This vegetative creature. And you have the Übermensch who is becoming like the gods. And I guess the final thing I'll say is I think it's very interesting that throughout the Western tradition, even in Christianity, we've had this focus on the idea of immortal life, right? The gods represent this kind of fountain of undying youth. And then that carried over into Christianity, the pursuit of immortal life. Christ is kind of a fountain of immortal life. Things like the Grail and all of this sort of stuff all ties into this idea of kind of a super, a source of super life or something like this. And of course, Christianity can stray away from this as well and kind of lead people away from life. But I think it's interesting that pursuit of immortal life and kind of pure life, beauty, vitality, and so on has been integral to the Western tradition, even in the Christian ethos.
Yeah, and this is something that Spengler talks about, the Faustian will of man. What is Faustian? Well, Faustian is when you see this vast expanse of space or water or land, and the will to conquer it, the will to occupy it. It's like Bap says, we must occupy space. That is the fundamental masculine drive. So, of course, in modernity, where everything exists within controlled space, where the only way to be masculine is maybe play sports, and you have rules and you have a referee and you have pads or whatever, right? There's a certain inauthenticity to it. Whereas the true virile will to life, let's say, or will to power, is to expand into the infinite. It's to aspire to infinity. It's to aspire to divinity. Um, and that to me, I think, is also sort of the Promethean will. The Promethean will is, well, as mortals, we eventually want to wield the power of the gods, which says to us, well, then the meaning of life is to become one of the gods. It's to transcend, it's to attain the infinite. And of course, even within Christianity or Buddhism or any of these other religions, there's always this eventual uh, re not necessarily rebirth. I mean, that's part of it, but it's like the essence is becoming one with the gods again eventually. Nirvana is almost like this in a sense, and of course it's different, but it's very similar. Uh, Going to heaven, it's essentially to return to God. If everyone is made in God's image, then the eventual goal is to return to that image, right? So it's like you're saying, in all these different religions, it's always this sort of will to the infinite. It's never this acceptance of what is finite. And I think precisely what you get with The Last Man is this acceptance of what is finite. It's this pessimism of well, there is nothing else to life but just essentially hedonism. But it's not even the cool kind of hedonism. It's not even the cool kind of Gabriele D'Annunzio decadence where you're this aristocrat who goes off into wars and then gets drunk and does drugs and has affairs. It's a very lame kind of decadence. It's like, what are you doing? Your pleasure is very base. It's very reduced. It's not the pleasure of Caesar. It's not the pleasure of Alexander. It's the pleasure that anyone can attain. And that's why, despite the fact that, of course, modern liberalism is incredibly capitalistic, it is very spiritually Marxist, because all these things that are sold in modernity are things that anyone can attain. Anyone can go get their double McCheeseburger or whatever. And I think this is essentially the conflicting views of life. Is one view of life is that, well, there's not much else to it. It's just very basic. It's stimuli. I want to, if I'm going to have to live, I'm just going to enjoy myself because there's no other meaning to it. There's nothing else. And of course, these kind of people aren't having children. These kind of people are very, depressed. They don't have forward vision because that vision has been stripped from them. Because modernity says, well, don't have kids. Kids are bad for the environment. Have a career, have this, have that. Well, ultimately, these things it's all very short-sightedness to a very material view of life, which is interesting because Nietzsche's view on life, in a lot of ways, is material, but it comes to very different conclusions. And I think ultimately, when we're talking about objective forms and aesthetic morality, we see a very clear will amongst people in our sphere versus people in like, let's say, the opposing sphere. And one sphere is the maximization of what we have. It's, well, I have this body, right? So the aesthetic ideal is having a beautiful body. And of course, as I've described in many videos before, what makes the body beautiful is its ability to act as an instrument of the individual's power, as of the individual's will to power. Because of course, with muscles you have strength. With strength, you have the ability to defeat your opponents, expand your will to power, etc. So, there's this very clear divide, and that divide is one side wants to expand once more, does not accept the station of which it was born, right? Essentially, what is our goal but not to become gods? What is our goal but not to become the Übermensch or lead humanity to eventually become the Übermensch? Because if you just take life as, oh well, heat death is going to exist one day, there's no point to anything, we're all going to die. Well, then why have children? Why do anything? And this is exactly what's happened. People aren't doing anything. People aren't having children because they believe there's no point. And I say, well, the point is that we're gonna turn everything over on its head. We're not going to accept entropy. We're going to expand, and we're going to advance, and we're going to evolve to a point where these rules that we think apply to us will no longer apply to us. We will embody the Promethean will and use this Promethean fire, which is our agency, and using our agency to produce technology, for example, to expand in our power, and to eventually wield the same power that we describe with the gods or with God or with metaphysics. That's what we're essentially trying to do. That is what we are offering to man. And that's what aesthetic morality is it's taking these objective forms, which we know will increase your power. And of course, beauty and power and all these things are all tied together. Essentially, power is an aesthetic phenomenon. It is an aesthetic phenomenon. It's an expression which will lead to material power. But like you say, if you take everything as just letting nature take its course, it becomes very nihilistic, might makes right and all this. So I guess our greater ideal is not just power, but is to resist entropy and to lead to something beyond entropy, to lead to something that goes beyond that very simple expression of life. And it's not just, well, I'm going to attain all this power so I can be some powerful, rich, wealthy billionaire or whatever. It's, I'm going to use this power to eventually have humanity evolve to something greater and to something better. So it's ultimately a white pill versus a black pill. It's the person who's given up and saying, okay, well, there's no point, so I'm just going to, jerk off and whatever, versus the guy who says, well, I'm not just going to give up and jerk off. I'm going to go get a goth girl harem. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. What worthier goal than that?
I mean, Nietzsche literally says this in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He says, go forth and procreate with big titty goth girls. This is in, I think, the 14th line of the chapter titled, black hair, pale skin, eyeliner, all these different things. So,
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that section. Yeah, definitely. And I think I talked about the hymn to Demeter in the last podcast we did, so I won't go into it too much, but I'm going to bring it up again anyway. Because on the one hand, there's, coming back to the idea of life as an intergenerational project, right? On the one hand, you have this kind of, basic idea that obviously, your parents reproduced and they create the next generation and they create the next generation. And a life is continually reborn each generation, and each generation of man is reborn each season. And this is where you get the idea of death as the reaper, right? He comes to reap every generation of man, just as the reaper, reaps the crops. And yet life is continually reborn. And this is what Persephone represents in the hymn to Demeter. She is reborn out of Hades, out of death, out of the earth, which is where plants also are born out of, and where men are buried when they die, and so on. But even more than this, you could have someone like a great hero who dies and never reproduces. Does that mean he's, broken off from the chain of life? Well, I think beneath this idea of life as an intergenerational project, you just have this idea of life as a divine force more generally. It's really a miracle when you think about it that life is, moving through time despite death. And, it's been doing that for billions of years. And so, your parents will die, but they created you and you're alive and you will create more life. And so I think the idea of life itself, this vital force as God or the gods is also integral to the Western tradition, right? And, again, the gods represent this force in Greek mythology, but then also in a kind of Europeanized Christian understanding, Christ can also represent this force, right? Life being resurrected, or God as the vital essence in life. I think that departs, of course, from the original meaning of Christianity, which I think is basically an inversion of the Eleusinian mysteries, pointing to life in heaven rather than, eternal life in heaven rather than eternal life in biology. But, that's a different matter. The point is that I think that, the kind of Western spirit is attracted to this idea of God or the gods, divinity, as this life force, this undying life force, which is continually resurrected. And I think that's represented in European morality, European pagan morality, and just generally, this morality continued even after Christianity became the majority religion. The attraction to beauty, the attraction to vitality, almost an obsession with it, because beauty represents, right, this life force in excess, right? Yes, to some degree, beauty could just be an indicator of health and so on, which, is still representative of healthy life, of vitality. But someone can be perfectly healthy and just be not that beautiful. But we are attracted to these qualities of life in excess, right? And again, that's what the gods represent and so on. And I think therein lies a morality, right? The attraction to the qualities of life in excess, but also the drive to try to create the qualities of life in excess, right? The drive towards them, the drive towards heroism, towards beauty, towards kind of improving man each generation, striving for things like the Übermensch, striving to build the most beautiful buildings, the tallest buildings, and so on.
Absolutely, and of course, you see this time and time again in mythos. And you mentioned the Eleusinian mysteries, and of course, there's a lot of study has got into the resurrection of Christ, and of course, relating it to the resurrection of Dionysus. And I've even read, actually, it's from Yukio Mishima, I feel like, and I think he wrote about this in one of his fictional books, Temple of Dawn, and they were talking about how the archetype for Dionysus, because Dionysus is actually a newer god. It's not. There's some studies that point to Dionysus not being originally quite part of the Aryan religion that comes down from the steppes, and is like a later addition actually from the east, which is interesting. But regardless, Christ is in a lot of ways a representation of Dionysus, which is interesting. But as you say, the meta of what we're talking about is this will to constantly survive, to constantly survive despite all this death, despite all these obstacles. There is this will beyond nature. There's this will beyond nature of something more. Because if we believe that we have the agency to eventually attain eternal life, then that is precisely the reason to continually reproduce. Because if eternal life was not possible, and I don't mean eternal life for the individual, but eternal life for, let's say, the species, or just life in general. If life was destined to die, or if we accepted, let's say we accepted life was destined to die. Let's say we accepted that heat death was inevitable and that there was nothing we could do about it. One's like, on a meta level, what is the point to anything if it's all just death? And the point that people subscribe or ascribe from that, like I've mentioned, is just, hedonism. It's just, well, I'm going to enjoy as much as I can in the time that I have. And of course, what we're saying is, well, our mythos for tens of thousands of years has been that we do have the agency to attain eternal life, if not for ourselves, then for the greater group. And of course, the question becomes, well, is eternal life supposed to refer to my eternal life, or the eternal life of the fact that there will be a future for my children and their children and their children, and for the human race as a whole? So it's very interesting. And I think that ultimately if we accept that the meaning of life, which could be an emergent property and not something inherently woven into the fabric of the universe, but let's say our emergent property of life, of the meaning of life, is that we want to attain eternal life. We want to ensure the promulgation of, let's say, the human species forever, for eternity. And maybe not even the human species, but something beyond that, right? An Übermensch race, a new race of people, whatever it may be, the new man, the future overman, whatever it may be. I'd say if we hold that the meaning of life is the increase of power, and thus, to increase our power, we must have a stronger man constantly evolving and constantly being put forward with every and each generation. Then there are specific forms that are objectively correct, which increase the ability to attain that goal, to attain that holy mission. And I like to keep these talks not too long, so I'm just going to give my last thoughts, and then I'll have you give your last thoughts. But what I want to leave the listener with is, if heat death is inevitable, which is what many theories claim, if entropy is inevitable, if the end of time, the end of space, and the end of life as we know it is considered inevitable, then I say, let us do the impossible. Let us do the impossible, and out of what seems like a hopeless end and an inevitable death, let us speak of life, and let us speak of eternal life. Let us speak of a will to power to defy entropy, and from it create something new. What we had deemed impossible, let's say 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, are our realities today. What we deem impossible today need not be our reality in the future. We have the agency, the Promethean will to do more, to be more. We have this ethos that has existed in every people throughout time, whether it's Christianity, Aryan paganism, or Buddhism, that there is a point of eternal life where we essentially will experience theosis and become one with the gods or one with the divine. This is something we've carried throughout our history, throughout our generations, and it should not die now. It should not die with this petty materialistic secularism. If we are going to be materialist, let's be materialist with the purpose of creating the divine out of the material. Let's do so with the will to turn what is impossible into our reality. Let us turn what is impossible into something that will become our goals. Let that be our metaphysics. That is what Prometheus represents. The impossible thing is man becoming God. But with Promethean fire, with this original gift, we can become gods. We can become divine, and we can overcome our circumstances. We have the agency, the will to do more and be more, and resist entropy, to resist what happened to the dinosaurs, to resist these inevitabilities. And even if the chances of this are so low, that is the meaning of life. It is taking the impossibilities and pursuing them anyway. It is the great life with content, not the long, comfortable life. So through struggle, through will, through a constant, we take bodybuilding, for example. Bodybuilding is breaking down your muscles, creating micro tears so that they rebuild stronger. It's giving your body constant stress that you will overcome. And that is precisely what I see with will to power and life as a whole, is there are these great challenges ahead of us. There's great challenges for the West today. There's great challenges for vitalism and exceptionalism in a world where those things seem to be considered sins, where slave morality and this sort of neo-Marxist cultural worldview is being expanded upon and subverting its way into the youth and into education, into the people. It seems like the perfect time for the eternal black pill. But in the wave, in the seas of black pills, I give you a white pill. I give you hope. This is, I believe that was the last spirit that did not leave Pandora's box, was hope. Hope was the last thing we held on to. And this hope should be used as the agency to propel ourselves to overcome all these obstacles in the way to divinity, in the way to godhood. So I say my aesthetic morality are the objective forms which increase my power to eventually lead humanity to an Übermenschen race, to a race that essentially our gods, the Babylonian Anunnaki or whatever. All right. I want to be like the Ark. The Ark currently lives in one such planet. So our goal is to eventually become like the race of people that live on Ark's planet. But I've gone on too long, and I'd like to hear Ark's final thoughts.
Yes. And I think when you embrace this Eleusinian or pagan understanding of life, it really cures nihilism. Of course, to cure nihilism on an individual level is something different than on a societal level. And you're still going to feel the effects of a, anti-life, decadent, or nihilistic society. But when you understand life as something that's here and now and within you and within biology, when you understand divinity as something that is here and now and within you, and that is intergenerational, not something that's in another world, not something which is atomized, that, you will die and then nothing matters, but something that is intergenerational, then that really revitalizes you. And, all, I think, nihilism stems from, whether it's, kind of early nihilism in Christianity, that all that matters is the individual soul and the salvation of the individual soul, or modern nihilism, that nothing matters since all that is real is the individual and the individual dies. If you believe in the Eleusinian view, then you look to history, you see all these great men, these great cultures, great civilizations, and know that they are an expression of the life force, of divinity. When you look around you, you see beauty in nature, you see beautiful people, you see divinity, and you can feel this force flowing within you. And I think that really is the solution to nihilism in modernity.
Absolutely. And I completely agree. And there is a great potential in this life force. And I think ultimately, when we talk about life as an emergent property, because if energy just randomly comes together and it leads to these things and life emerges from there, well, then what else can emerge from there? And we have great potential to actualize all these different crazy ideas we have in our heads. We can actualize Earth to become like Ark's planet. So when you embrace this vital life force and you see it as something that's not fixed even, right? Like you don't see the future as destined. You see it as open and constantly altered. Then you also say then, well, from there, many things can happen, which are even greater than I can even imagine now. So the ultimate view of hope is believing that more can come, that our potential means we can be beyond what we even fathom currently. So ultimately, in a lot of ways, what is metaphysical is potential. Well, you say, well, I have the potential to attain godlike powers, right? You're already seeing some of those godlike powers with technology. So who's to say what we can or can't accomplish in the future? But thank you for joining me, Ark. I hope next time you can make the trip over from your great planet, billions of light years away, and we won't have to just talk digitally over our whatever technology you sent me the other day that we're using right now. But yeah, thank you for joining me, and always a pleasure to speak with you.
Yes, likewise, and thank you for having me.
All right, everybody. Well, Legionaries, as always, this is the Warrior Philosopher, building the foundations of the Warrior Philosophy. Embrace your Promethean will, embrace the Faustian spirit, and conquer the world, occupy space, and start building your harem of goth girls. Signing out.